everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Erin Kang. My pronouns are they and she.
Hi, everyone. My name is Numeri Alam. I'm ONN's data strategy manager, and my pronouns are she and her.
Thanks so much for being here with me today, Nimeri. I'm so excited to chat with you about data and governance and data governance. So I'm curious, I've worked with you for a while now, and I know that you absolutely love just nerding out over data and data possibilities. So where did this interest and passion for data start in your life?
Thank you so much, Erin. And I'm so excited to be here as well. I think, for me, my journey with data uh, is a reflection of all the things that I've sort of come to love academically. I love science and math. I've always, I think, have been a pretty geeky, nerdy human. And, working with data allows me a chance to embrace um, embrace those aspects of myself. But I also love storytelling, and I love building narratives, and I love you know looking at information and connecting it to the stories that we tell and share. And that for me is really where my interest in the nonprofit sector and working and supporting nonprofits in figuring out their data journeys and narratives really comes from.
I love that answer because I think it really brings together the fact that you often like to remind us that data isn't just like the numbers and the science. It is the stories and the meanings that we attach to data. So I think, as not a data nerd, it is easy to kind of be like, oh, data's over there. Like that's not something that I'm good at, or maybe even care about. But data is actually all around us, and I think that reminder is one I always appreciate. So let's start with some basics, though. What is data governance?
Yeah, so I think before we can even get into data governance, we should very briefly talk just about data. And like you said, like data is just raw, disorganized facts that have been collected together. And when we're talking about data, we really want to be mindful of how we're talking about quantitative data, which is numbers, stats, etc., and qualitative data, which is often interviews, conversations, art, all of those other forms, other non-numerical forms of data. Because I think sometimes can we can think about data as only being quantitative. And we also have to ground ourselves in the fact that, data on its own does not necessarily have any real meaning until we assign it meaning, right? A number or a fact is just a number or a fact until we say, this is how we are going to look at it and use it and interpret it, and help us better form our decisions and opinions about other things. And so, we also know from the work that we've done that all organizations, all nonprofits collect and to various degrees manage, store, analyze, and use data. So, whether you're tracking your expenses, you keep your registration forms in a drawer or a plastic bag, or you check out the popularity of, your tweets and blog posts, that's all data that you're already collecting and already using, and maybe you're not even aware of it.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, as you describe, data can be so nebulous and open to interpretation.
Mhm.
In the data framework, you describe that data governance is the approach that you take to your organization's data. So that can encompass everything from policies and practices to tools and standards and metrics and all of that around your data.
Yeah. So as an organization, when you build your data governance plan, and sometimes we call it, like, it can be called a data governance framework. Really what you're doing is you're making sure that everybody in your organization is on the same page about how to handle your data. So, we don't want to get into like the specifics of the several approaches and components, but data governance as a concept is really key because it establishes a very different relationship for organizations to their data. And it's one that allows organizations to think about their ownership, control of the data, and be even more accountable to the data that they are collecting and storing and using.
Right. So, what then could data governance look like in an organization?
Yeah, that's an awesome question because um, I totally appreciate that sometimes, governance and frameworks can be more abstract or ideological. But, the two that I'm going to plug, one is our good friends at OFIFC, the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. They have a research framework called USE, our Utility, Self-Voicing, Access, and interrelationality. And this, framework sort of outlines how, how can research happen respectfully in Indigenous communities and with Indigenous communities. And it sort of outlines again, these elements of who shares the data and how is it shared and how is it how do you make sense of it together. Another data framework that I think is really brilliant is the one that was produced by the Black Health Equity Working Group, which sort of emerged out of the lack of data and information on how COVID-19 was impacting Black folks across Canada and across Ontario. And so they developed a data governance framework called EGAP, which stands for Engagement, Governance, Access, and Protection. And so both of these frameworks, really outline ways in which folks can think through the process of data collection, storage, management, handling, etc., and will, I think, help organizations think about those various elements of the data lifecycle, and think about, how does governance apply to these different parts of the data lifecycle.
Mm. Those examples are so helpful because it's this kind of foundational sort of thinking and getting clear on like what the framework is that allows like people or organizations or teams to like in the future when you're dealing with challenges or questions to be able to go back to these kinds of frameworks or fundamentals. I think we see that really similarly with governance work as well. But a lot of the time like the energy or the capacity or the resources to actually do that work aren't always easily findable, unless of course there's a pressing need to then look at something and be like, oh, we need to work on this. But the two examples you shared really for me demonstrate what organizations can do to prepare, right, to better prepare and to just better be able to do their work day to day, if they are able to put the energy into creating some kind of data governance framework.
Yeah.
Can you describe a little bit more for us what the relationship between data and governance looks like?
Yeah. So, I think that data and governance, it's such an interesting sphere for me because they're so tightly connected in my head. But folks may not always see the connection between them. But the two things that like pop up for me are one, both data and governance are nonprofit infrastructure tools. And what I mean by that is that they can be used to help an organization fulfill their mission and mandate. Neither data nor governance has to be the core function or the purpose of the organization. I mean, there are exceptions, but they can be used alongside other nonprofit tools to help an organization bring their purpose to fruition. The other connection that I really see is that, again, increasingly there is this interest that's around data collection that's happening about governance. And what I mean by that is that we're seeing so many reports, research and initiatives that are exploring different governance models and connecting governance and equity more broadly, and also demonstrating how effective governance can support good work. So those two pieces, one, data and governance as nonprofit tools, but also the application of data collection methodologies to organizational governance practices, can really help bridge that relationship, and unite what might for some people be two very different things or ways to think about their nonprofit world.
Hmm. And so in the last few years with all the work that you've been doing, what have you seen or learned as you've connected with different nonprofits? Are there different kinds of projects or trends and patterns that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that um, increasingly over the years, nonprofits are uh, they have always, I think, been interested in data, and they're becoming more adept at using and understanding data. um, I often connect to nonprofits that have data projects. So they're, have like a specific project, uh, and they often also have these are pre-existing organizational governance structures, like a board of directors. And sometimes these organizations can have like a separate like advisory board or steering committee specific to their data project, who can help them develop policies and practices that are applicable for the project itself, right? So, and in talking to nonprofits, I sometimes wonder if there's this missed opportunity for their organization to delve more deeply into their relationships with data, right? And to build out the systems that they need for their data as a whole, as opposed to piecemealing it, or developing for one specific initiative. So I think these two entities, again, like data and governance, can actually learn a lot from each other, and can really support the process of building data capacity within the organization as a whole. And it then encourages this development of data culture, and learning, because now you have folks that are supporting the organization's work, as, let's say, a board of directors, who have a better understanding, not just of a specific data project, but of the organization's data, and then can help make key decisions around the organization's health and well-being based off of this data.
Hmm. It's a really good point, and it touches on, I think, a challenge that has, it manifests throughout the nonprofit sector in a lot of different ways around siloing, right? We have this tendency to kind of put out a working group here to look at, for example, data, or to, be in charge of equity, right? Or even with governance, and I think this is again where there's such a parallel between our work, you with data and myself with governance, is we also then put kind of all the governance roles and responsibilities into one structure as well, the board of directors. And I can really see this missed opportunity for example, for organizations that they don't get together to get aligned and get a clear understanding of how governance is actually defined and interpreted, and then have that inform how their governance systems are built out. And
Mhm.
instead, a lot of the time, the systems we put in place are a combination of, like, years of culture and habits that come out into this artifact of the board, or with different understandings of what governance is, and we end up using these really cookie cutter models of governance rather than having that interconnected understanding and practice as you're describing.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's really cool. I think we talk a lot about, when we shift about looking at governance as a whole, not just data
Mhm.
governance, but governance as a
Yeah.
concept, as more than just like this one structure that holds fiduciary duties, and
Mhm.
actually seeing it as this holistic ecosystem where the board is critical, but it's only a part. It's this huge shift, right? And you're talking about making decisions together guided by data. Governance is about how we make decisions together. So, really shifting, I think, how we think about data and governance, it really helps us to create and imagine these new kinds of connections and relationships for the board and for others to get involved in both, right? So we're not actually talking about, oh my gosh, now, organizations have to add data to their list and governance to their list of all these things to look at and examine, but really that it's all part of the same conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So all this to say, we've talked a
Mhm.
lot here. What do you think is important for people to take away about data governance?
Yeah, so I think, it's really important, and to your point that, data governance doesn't become an administrative task or like an additional burden for nonprofits, that instead it can be seen as a way to encourage nonprofits to closely examine the data that they collect and determine how they can best handle it, so that they can use it appropriately, and better. When we think about the potential of data, and this is something that I'm deeply passionate about, to help us really pinpoint future problems and map out solutions to both internal and external issues. We know as a sector, we need our data to be good, which means that we need our data to be collected ethically, for it to be stored properly, for it to be standardized and handled appropriately, and for it to be reviewed in context. Um, and again, like, data is just, it's so fascinating because the significance that we place on it is what we allocate to it. And so we're limited in how we can use our data if it's not consistent, relevant, or reliable. Um, I also think that for nonprofits, having this data governance plan can help them protect vulnerable data, the data that we collect about populations we may serve, or our donors, or our staff. It can help us think about what protections are needed, and who has access to what kinds of information. It can tell us where to invest our limited resources. So, does it make sense to have better data management, or does it make sense to have, more protection? And how does the nonprofit incorporate data capacity into their professional development program or planning? Lastly, I think that the data governance plans allows organizations to pause, and I think this is something else that you and I share in our projects, is this, um, is a push, our need for a bit of a moment to reflect on, on governance and our data. And we totally appreciate that it's something, sometimes nonprofits just can't do that. But if they can, right, then we can ask the people, ask, our staff, our volunteers, our community members to come together and have really complex discussions on things like data ownership and privacy, and decide as a group, on how we proceed together. So, data then, that point about shifting, can data shifts from something that organizations do because they're required to, because they have, they're facing pressure from funders, or pre-existing, data sharing agreements, etc., or other our other project partners to it being an internal tool, maybe even a friend that is useful and resonates with their mission, values, and culture. And I think that, the takeaway around data governance is hopefully that it, is um, an an element that exists outside of specific projects, and that if you have data projects and you're probably already developing tools, policies, practices, etc., and maybe we can encourage folks to take a step back and think about applying those more broadly, and expanding the knowledge outside of project specific folks to the organization as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, wow, the time flew. So thank you so much for joining me for this chat today. Clearly, data and governance are such important pillars to sort of the overall health and well-being of not just our organizations, but I think the network, the sector, and our communities as a whole. So, but clearly also they require infrastructure and resources to do it as well. So do you have any last words to share before we head out?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, shameless plug for folks to check out the deal, the data evidence use and learning framework that we've developed at ONN, and also, just a reminder for folks that data is part of our organizational infrastructure, and infrastructure takes time, and it takes mistakes, and it takes mapping and remapping to make happen. So, really try if you can to manage those expectations, and think about your data and your governance as part of that infrastructure that you are building. Sometimes I liken data infrastructure to road infrastructure, because I think it's much more visual and apparent. And when we think about our roads, we're also talking about laws, policies, practices, a culture that we have evolved over time around driving, signs, and these complexities. But it wasn't always there. It wasn't natural. We weren't born with it. It has really taken time for us to get to where we are. So I just hope that as folks explore these things, they remember to be patient, and to be kind to themselves as they go through this process.
Very important reminders, I think, particularly as I think the sector's full of folks who are hard on ourselves, and we can't do all the things, and we can't do all the things right away. So I appreciate those reminders. And I had such a fun time chatting with you. Thank you so much for talking about data and governance with me.
Thank you, Erin, for this opportunity. This was a blast.
Just two nerds. All right. Thank you. I'll see you soon.